Hello, my name is Max Raymond Mahalik. Today is May the 7th of 2022, and I decided to do my third portfolio project on feedback loops in the non-gravid female reproductive system. And throughout this presentation, I am going to be moving myself around a little bit just to make sure you guys can visualize the whole presentation. But first, to cover things, I just want to go over some essential hormones that are key to the reproductive system of a non-gravid female. So first, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, abbreviated GnRH. Gonadotropin releasing hormone subsequently induces the release or stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. And then these two further stimulate the ovaries, and we see that the ovaries produce estrogen, estradiol. We're gonna refer to as estrogen in this presentation, as silverthorne does as well. Then progesterone, inhibin, and then anti-mullerian hormone. Just a few things to point out. Inhibin is going to inhibit the release of FSH, and then anti-mullerian hormone, we'll talk about the details in the coming slides, or just very briefly. But a real big picture thing to look at down here, which is going to be one of our main focuses in this presentation, is estrogen's effect on gonadotropin releases, so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So with low estrogen levels, there's an absence of a negative or positive feedback. There's no feedback loop initiated with low levels of estrogen. So we see normal gonadotropin release. With moderate estrogen levels, we actually see a negative feedback. So it's feeding back and decreasing the amount of luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, growth, gonadotropin releasing hormone, sorry. We're seeing a decrease in all those. With high levels of estrogen, we further see this we still see a negative feedback, but if we have continued high levels of estrogen, then we observe a positive feedback. Which is very interesting. So we go from a negative with moderate and acutely high estrogen to sustained high estrogen, we have a positive feedback. So we go from a negative to positive, which is very interesting. And kind of moving on here. So I just want to give a quick overview here too of the ovarian and menstrual cycle. So the ovarian cycle has two different phases and ovulation in the center. So it has a follicular phase, which outlines follicular growth, the growth of the follicle. Then we have ovulation, where the oocyte is released from the ovary. Then we have the luteal phase, which the ruptured follicle becomes the corpus luteum, which will secrete further hormones related to pregnancy. And we'll talk about that in later slides. And then we have the menstrual cycle. They obviously will overlap to some degree. So we first have menses, which is the period of menstrual bleeding, and it corresponds to the early follicular phase in the ovarian cycle. Then we have the proliferative phase. This is a period of endometrial proliferation, and this corresponds to the late follicular phase in the ovarian cycle. Then we have the secretory phase, which is following ovulation, and it corresponds with the luteal phase. This is where hormones are secreted by the corpus luteum and turn the thick endometrial layer into more of a secretory structure. So moving on from here, now we have the early follicular phase. This begins after day 1 of menstruation, but just prior to that, we see that gonadotropin secretion increases just prior to menses. And we see with this gonadotropin increase, we're obviously seeing an increase in FSH, which indicates initiates maturation of several different follicles, several different tertiary follicles that will start to grow, and one of these will eventually become the dominant follicle, which will be the one that is eventually released into the egg will produce the egg that is eventually released into the oviduct. And then we see with an increased FSH, we see granulosa cells, they increase their secretions, and granulosa cells increase or secrete estrogen. And they also secrete anti-mullerian hormone, which in this case, anti-mullerian hormone is preventing from the preventing from more follicles from maturing. So we just have this one set of tertiary follicles that start to mature and no more. But we see this continued, and this is going to be our first feedback loop. We see this continued estrogen release. So estrogen is being stimulated to be released, and estrogen actually feeds back to gonadotropin-releasing hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, and it negatively feeds back to these and creates an environment where those are lowering. But why does estrogen stay elevated then? Because estrogen actually feeds back to the granulosa cells, which are producing estrogen, and it positively feeds back to the granulosa cells, and we see kind of this cycle, so estrogen can remain high. And we see that at the same time with this elevated FSH, we see luteinizing hormone, the release of luteinizing hormone causes the theca cells, which we see theca cells right here. We see an increased secretion from them, and they release androgens, which the androgens can then be converted via aromatase into estrogen. So we even see more estrogen stimulating granulosa cells, and we see this positive feedback of estrogen. So with the increased estrogen levels, I explained that they provide the negative feedback loop to the gonadotropins and gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And then we see the positive feedback of the granulosa cells to secrete more estrogen, so then the follicles can continue to grow. So with the positive feedback to the granulosa cells, and we still have this high level estrogen, we can continue, the follicles can continue to grow, but we have low levels of SFH and LH occurring, or lower levels, which allow for normal follicular growth without new follicles being beginning a maturation process. At the same time, this late in the early follicular phase, we see that menstruation ends, and then we see endometrial proliferation starting. The endometrium epithelial start to grow, preparing for pregnancy or implantation, and then the cervix secretions become kind of watery and clear, preparing for sperm entry. So moving on to the mid to late follicular phase, estrogen is going to peak during this time. And at this time, we're only going to have that dominant follicle present. So all this positive feedback I just described of estrogen with the granulosa cells, now we're seeing this estrogen peak. So granulosa cells continue the secretion of estrogen as well as inhibin, which inhibin is going to feed back to FSH negatively and decrease FSH that way. And then small amounts of progesterone as well are being released from the granulosa cells. So this increased estrogen level, now with it continually being high, we are going to see a switch to a positive feedback to gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So that is going to stimulate more FSH and luteinizing hormone release. Furthermore, we're going to see these small levels of progesterone having a positive feedback on luteinizing hormone. So we're going to see luteinizing hormone, we're going to see a peak in it. And I'll talk about this peak or this surge in just a second. But just prior to ovulation, we see the high levels of estrogen and progesterone. And then we also see with the high levels of estrogen and small levels of progesterone, we're going to see an increase of insensitivity to gonadotropin-releasing hormone by the anterior pituitary gland. So that coupled with the increased release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone via this positive feedback with estrogen, as well as the positive feedback to luteinizing hormone with small amounts of progesterone, we're going to see the luteinizing hormone surge. We see a smaller surge with follicle-stimulating hormone because it is being inhibited by inhibin. So the high levels of estrogen level stimulates further endometrial proliferation. At this time, the cervix secretions are going to be optimal for sperm entry. They're going to be thin and stringy mucus. And then the luteinizing hormone surge, very importantly, triggers oocyte maturation, and meiosis will resume. So we'll have that primary oocyte turn into a secondary oocyte, 4N to 2N. Then we have the process of ovulation occurring. So ovulation occurs about 16 to 24 hours after the luteinizing hormone peak that I just talked about, the surge. And we see maturation of the follicle, or mature follicles secrete prostaglandins, and as well as proteolytic enzymes, which kind of dissolve the follicular connective tissue and release the egg. and it's still kind of surrounded by 2 to 3 layers of granulosa cells, and then it's guided into the oviduct by the fimbriae. And we kind of see this peak here of luteinizing hormone, and then we see ovulation directly following that. And we also see the peak of estrogen timing with the peak of FSH and luteinizing hormone. Let me move myself back real quick. So in the luteal phase, this is the last phase of the ovarian cycle, we see the corpus luteum forms. So the theca cells and the granulosa cells, they migrate to the antrum space that is now ruptured of the follicle, and they transform into luteal cells. These luteal cells release estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin, which these now we have lower levels of estrogen and progesterone, and these are going to provide a negative feedback to the gonadotropin releasing hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone. So now we have this negative feedback loop returning with these lower levels of estrogen. Progesterone is the dominant hormone at the luteal phase, and given this, the endometrial layer becomes a kind of secretory structure, and the cervix mucus, the mucus secretions become very thick, and they prevent sperm entry, prevent bacterial entry. So at this time, we would think that sperm have already made it in if this was the case of fertilization. But we're talking about a non-gravid female here. So late in the luteal phase, we then see the corpus luteum undergoes apoptosis and becomes an inactive structure called the corpus albicans. And with this, since this structure is inactive, progesterone and estrogen are going to decrease. We're not going to have this negative feedback on gonadotropin-releasing hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone. We are subsequently going to see this negative feedback just completely diminish because we don't have any estrogen providing negative feedback. It's too low to provide that negative feedback. In the early luteal phase, you'd have kind of a moderate level. Now we have not the absence, but a low level of estrogen, which removes that negative feedback. And then we see the endometrial layer, it starts to degrade down after about 2 days after this, the corpus albicans forms, and this is about 14 days after ovulation, after this drop in progesterone and estrogen. And then there's my resources.